Okay, folks, today we have a 2009 BMW 750 Li 4.4 liter dual turbo V8. This here is the transmission, automatic 6-speed transmission that comes out of it, model 6HP-28, or is it 26? Let's see, I can't remember. Yes, 28. Okay, so initially this car came in with a complaint of several oil leaks. We diagnosed the problem as oil coming from underneath the turbos. Little housing for the return lines was leaking. Practically the gasket no longer existed underneath it. Had lost its ability to seal the cover, and so when you pulled it up, it was just oil all over the place, all in the valley of the engine. And it has a little weep hole in the backside of the engine casting where it allows it to run down, and it'll run inside of this transmission. And as you can see all of these marks here. That is from the oil running down, and then the flywheel as it's spinning, just splattering it all over the place. So we found that leak, and that's what we have. We fixed that. But when I put it back together, drove it, and discovered that it had another leak. It's like, where is that coming from? So I assumed that it was from the rear main seal, but it wasn't. So the way I found that out was because while it was running, I had cleaned the engine off already before. I was ready to give the car back because I knew that I found the oil leak. Well, discovered that while I had it, I jacked it up on 4 stands because the job is being done mobily. I jacked it up on 4 stands, started the vehicle up, and immediately, and I cleaned it all back up, I'm sorry. Cleaned it off with brake cleaner, I believe it was, just to make sure that I didn't have any leaks, or make sure everything was dry. Started it up, and it started dripping from right inside of this little hole here. You see right there, there's transmission fluid right there. So it started dripping from there, and I kept thinking, man, okay, so the rear main seal is leaking. Well, I stuck my finger up there and I pulled it down, I touched it, smelled it, it was transmission fluid. So I thought, really? Okay, that makes sense. So at any rate, pull the transmission down. One of the first things I noticed was when I pulled it out, I got it down on the jack and I pulled the torque converter out. When I pulled the torque converter out, initially there was inside of the hub there, and I'll walk back there in a minute and show you. Matter of fact, let me just go ahead and show you. In this area of where you see fluid now, that was completely dry, with the exception of this little bit right here that had run down when I was pulling the torque converter out. But I noticed, one of the things I noticed was that the entire housing of the torque converter was dry. So that suggested to me that the seal wasn't leaking. Now this is from sitting and rocking back and forth. I don't know how that got up there, but any rate, there was the whole internal, the side that faces the transmission, the hub side, it did not have any fluid on it. So that kind of, made me think, well, maybe it's not the seal. But also, when I pulled the torque converter down, I just kept staring at the front of the pump. And what I noticed was that, see these bolts here? That one was wet. That one was wet. The bottom one seemed to be dry. That was a little wet, but I say, okay. It didn't look too bad. So notice that these bolts around here were a little wet. So what it made me start thinking, I said, man, I wonder if these bolts have been disturbed before. But I also remember when I was taking this transmission out, looking at the drive shaft, I could tell that bolts had, or excuse me, that someone had pulled the drive shaft out, at least for some reason I didn't know. And I was also, when I pulled the bell housing bolts out, the 2 bottom ones, this one and this one, they were not really tight. The rest of them were pretty tight, but not as tight as they should have been. And you could also see witness marks from where a socket had been placed on them and they had been removed. So that was one of the first things I noticed, and I thought, and when I was pulling it out initially, I was like, man, somebody's had this transmission out before. I wonder what for. Was I kept looking at these bolts here. I noticed that right underneath that washer, between the washer and the pump casting, it was wet. That's kind of uncommon. If it was running from the bottom of this seal, it'd just be running down along the casting housing and just running out the front. Why would those bolts be wet? I said, okay, well, that just could be oil. No biggie. Kept looking around here, and I started noticing at the bottom of the actual pump, if you look right here where it goes into the pump housing, it's wet all in between this, the pump and the pump housing. It's wet. So let me see if I can back up and show you this here. I'm gonna try to expand, but if you notice, there's oil all the way in. There's oil not only in the bottom of there, but it's starting to go all the way up to the side of the pump. That makes more sense, because when it heats up and it's running, this is where all your pressure is coming from. The pump is leaking from the seal. The seal is leaking around the pump. Now, what I don't know, but it looks like, and I could be wrong, looks like somebody's been in this transmission before. If they haven't, no biggie, we're going to go ahead and fix it. But this is why visual inspections, again, are so important. I mean, of course, you have to look at it in order to diagnose it, but sometimes it's just overlooked, and you come down here and you replace a seal, the torque converter seal, which is this guy right here. This is the torque converter seal. You come down here and replace that, and you think you got your problem fixed, and you don't. You put it back together, and it's still leaking. You're really upset because you got to pull it out. Now, this transmission isn't the worst I've ever pulled out, so it's not that big of a deal, but you definitely don't want to do the job twice because you only get paid for it once. And I'm the type person, if I pull this out before I gave it back to him, then I'd pull it back out again, but I wouldn't be particularly thrilled about that. So at any rate, here we are. We're putting this, we're going to go ahead and clean this all out and everything. We're going to order our parts, pull this pump out and change the seal in it, put it back together to stop it from leaking, and that should square us away. We're also going to change the rear main seal because we did buy it initially, because according to BMW's, there's a technical service bulletin on the leak underneath the turbos, but what it also said to do was to inspect the rear engine cover, and also change the rear main seal. So we'd already initially purchased them. We didn't think we'd have to do it until we found this leak. So, but while we're back here, we're going to take the flywheel down, which has to be I want to mention something about the flywheel, but let me finish what I was about to say. We're going to go ahead and change the rear main seal and the rear engine cover, not simply just because we bought it, but because we pulled the transmission down. And anytime you pull it down, if it hasn't been replaced recently, strongly recommend you change a rear main seal always, because it'll be if it's 6 months later and you have to do it again to the customer, they may be a little upset. All they have to just talk to one person if they don't know, then and discover that, well, you had the transmission down, why didn't you replace it? Not only that, it's a good practice to do. I've been doing it since I was 15 years old. As I recall, anytime you pull the transmission down, just change the rear main seal, especially if it's a one-piece seal. It's very easy to take the flywheel off, and or the flex plate off, and you don't have that problem. So I wanted to mention something about the flex plate. Let's take a look at it. So it's really important when you pull this transmission down to take really good care not to you want to back it off of the housing. You don't want it to drop. You want to space it about an inch away from the transmission as you're lowering it down. You have to be really careful. We didn't pull the exhaust on this, we kept it in here, but I mentioned that for a very specific reason. See this flex plate, see those notches in the bottom of there? That is how the crankshaft position sensor reads the position of the crankshaft. And so if you bend that anyway, as a matter of fact, so if you look here, I'm see if we got enough light. Oh yes, I have my flashlight. So I'll show you something. So this flywheel, if you look and you think it just has all the notches are just alike, it isn't. So if you go around here, notice how that portion, oh wait, I just saw it. this portion of the flywheel right here, there's a really big gap in there. It doesn't have teeth all the way around inside of, let's see, I can get a better picture right there. See how that big wide gap is in there? It only has one of those. If you go around this entire flywheel, you'll only see that it only has one of those gaps. That's top dead center. So it tells the it tells the sensor where position number 1 of the crank is. So yes, that's important to fix. To make sure that when you pull this transmission out, that you don't damage this flywheel, because you'll have all sorts of drivability problems if you ding it. And trust me, the car will be running funny, customer trying to figure out what's wrong with it. If you're a technician who's worth your weight in salt or gold or whatever you find valuable, you'll be trying to figure out what's wrong with it, and it'll all be your fault, because you bent this flywheel, and the sensor doesn't know what's going on. It's just picking up what it's reading. But if you ding it any kind of way, you'll have problems. So it's really critical that you pay close attention when pulling this transmission out. Any type of these are in a lot of Chryslers products. The flywheel is built like this, and so, or the flex plate is built like this with the ring inside of it mounted to it so that it can read the crank sensor. A lot of your GM cars, it's mounted on the crankshaft itself, and the sensor's mounted in the side of the block. This crankshaft position sensor is mounted in the transmission bell housing, and it reads it directly off this flex plate. So be very careful about doing this. If not, you'll have a really big headache on your head, and you'll be trying to figure out what you did wrong. And again, you notice here how wet it is down there. This is actually from the oil that was coming out of the weep hole at the top of the engine, but we're going to go ahead and replace it while we got it out. The rear main seal, that is, which actually comes with the whole housing and all of that. And then the engine cover is right up there behind there. If you see those 2 bolts there, there's a little engine cover that needs to be replaced on the back side of it. So we'll just go ahead and replace it since we got it out. But that is it for this evening. Car Specialist, and we're out.